Hi there, I'm Don Daler. Elaine Quijano is on assignment. Vice President Joe Biden is under fire for comments he made about working with segregationists. At a fundraiser Tuesday evening, Biden invoked two late senators by name. They were staunch opponents of desegregation. Biden spoke about serving in the Senate with them during the 1970s. He said while they didn't agree on much of anything, at least they, quote, got things done. He fondly recalled what he dubbed an era of civility. Not everyone felt this was something to celebrate. That includes 2020 rival Senator Cory Booker. In a statement, he expressed disappointment Biden didn't issue a, quote, immediate apology for the pain his words are dredging up for many Americans. Other candidates weighed in as well. Senator Kamala Harris told CBS News Biden's comment, quote, concerns me deeply. And Elizabeth Warren added it's, quote, never okay to celebrate segregationists. Biden responded earlier tonight.
I ran for the United States Senate because I disagreed with the views of the segregationists and many of them in the Senate at the time. As I led the Judiciary Committee, I was able to pass, what I was talking about was the Voting Rights Act. I was able to pass the Voting Rights Act when I was a young senator, when he was still the chairman. We voted against him and beat him in the Voting Rights Act. Secondly, when I was chairman of the committee, I extended the Voting Rights Act for 25 years, not 5 years. In addition to that, I made it very clear by the last time as I was on that committee, I was chairman of Foreign Relations, but I was a lead Democrat. We extended another 25 years, and we got 98 out of 98 votes for it. The point I'm making is you don't have to agree. You don't have to like the people in terms of their views, but you just simply make the case and you beat them. You beat them without changing the system.
How does it feel that your Democratic rivals are implicitly saying that you have issues talking about race?
They know better.
Are you going to apologize like Cory Booker
Apologize for what?
Cory Booker's called for it.
Cory should apologize. He knows better. There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career, period.
Anita Dunn, Biden's surrogate and former aide to President Obama, also responded to the criticism earlier.
He didn't praise them. He didn't praise their positions. He certainly didn't endorse their positions. It's a story he's told many times, and the point of the story is that you have to be able to work with people, even if they hold positions repugnant to you, in order to make some progress.
Earlier, my colleague Tanya Rivero spoke to our red and blue panel about the growing backlash.
Joining me now are Michael Scherer, Susan Page, Antjuan Seawright, and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Michael is a political reporter for The Washington Post. Susan is the Washington bureau chief for USA Today. Antjuan is a Democratic strategist and CBSN political contributor, and Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. She joins us from Columbia, South Carolina. Welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being with us. Susan, let me start with you. What do you think the point Biden was trying to make here was?
Well, Biden was trying to make a point he's made from the start of his campaign, which is that he's someone who can return to an era of American politics that had more civility, more action across party lines, actually got things done. That's a point he's been making, but he made it in the clumsiest possible way. James Eastland wasn't just a segregationist, he was a white supremacist. And to invoke his name as an era of civility is something that clearly offended some people, including two of the African Americans who are now running for president. Kamala Harris said that if Jim Eastland had had his way, she would not be a U.S. senator today.
Yeah. So, Antjuan, how are we seeing these issues of race and justice shape the conversations in the Democratic primary right now?
Well, I think they are majority of the conversation. And be clear, I don't think the vice president was praising them. I think he was offering the suggestions that we have to get back to a place in American politics of where Democrats and Republicans can work together. And I think he was speaking to what 63% of the American people want, a Washington, D.C. that will work. At the end of the day, if I were him, I would have used a different example or other examples in a time period in our history where Democrats and Republicans have worked together. But on the flip side, he cannot run away from his past, because the one thing he doesn't want is for voters to think that he is not being authentic, not being honest, and not being genuine about who he is, positions he's had, or people he stood with or worked with. So it's a double-edged sword for the vice president. What I will say is that for the people who are critical of Joe Biden, there are some who argue that working with Donald Trump in this modern-day era of politics that we live in now could be compared to the same. And so when you're in this business, politics is a contact sport. The vice president should expect that people are going to hit him on where he gives them a reason to hit him, and he has to respond in a way that will make sense to put all this to rest.
That's right. Caitlin, how would you respond to that? You know, as Antjuan just said, Biden has a lot of double-edged swords in his past. And he did say in his remarks, the new left calls me, quote, old-fashioned. So do these comments that he's making, though, run the risk of proving that point?
I think they do. I think Biden has been this whole time trying to run a general election campaign against Donald Trump without paying attention really to the Democratic primary. And in that Democratic primary, candidates and voters and activists are having a real and open public conversation about race in America. Just today on Capitol Hill, the House held a hearing on reparations. That's an issue that we're hearing from voters and candidates alike, how the country should address this issue. Inequality is something that the candidates are talking a lot about. And so I think this is another issue that, at least in rhetoric, that puts the vice president kind of away from all of these other candidates in the party. And what was striking to me about the comments from Anita Dunn speaking about Joe Biden was that she said, look, he tells this story all the time. And I think that kind of tells you everything you need to know about how Biden has been running this campaign, not really engaging in any new kind of tactics or new conversations, really, but doing things the way that he has always done. We'll see whether voters penalize him for that. I'm going to be asking voters here on the ground about these comments. Here in South Carolina, at least, he is very beloved. He's leading in the polls here. And of course, he'll be here in just a couple of days.
Well, going back to Biden surrogate Anita Dunn, let's play another clip from earlier today. Let's listen.
Cory Booker, who has worked with Jeff Sessions on many things. Elizabeth Warren talks about how she's worked with Chuck Grassley, who led the fight for Brett Kavanaugh and who wouldn't even meet with Merrick Garland. And Elizabeth Warren tells a story about how she has worked with Chuck Grassley for over-the-counter hearing aids to save money for people. The reality is that
but none of these people are currently espousing segregationist views.
Well, I would just say that many of them are espousing views that are anathema to many people in the Democratic Party when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to, you know, some pretty broad civil rights issues that all of us feel very strongly about.
So, Susan, what sort of argument is Dunn making there? She's making the same one that you were saying earlier, the point that Biden is trying to make.
She's proving the adage that you're better off with an offense than a defense. Which is trying to pull these other candidates in other situations in which they've worked across party lines, which is certainly true. But I think this is actually a broader problem for Joe Biden, because one of the fundamental questions he has yet to answer is he in touch with today's Democratic Party? Or is he more a reflection of an earlier time in the Democratic Party that is now over? And he reinforces those questions by comments like the one he made at this fundraiser.
All right. Now, Michael, I know that you have reported on how, quote, Democrats are fretting over the never-ending Trump show. How is the era of President Trump shaping the way that we are seeing the Democratic primary play out?
Well, the biggest way is simply that the Trump and what he does every day is such a bigger ratings draw than anything all 23 candidates on the Democratic side have been doing. If you look at social media measures, if you look at money raised, if you look at Google searches, if you look at mentions on cable television, Trump continues to dominate, and he's shown out of his 2016 election and as president that he can benefit from that attention even when it's incredibly negative attention. He's found a way to use negative press as a way of delivering his message to the American people. And I think that's a concern for Democratic strategists who have polled the country and basically decided at this point that the way they will win is to focus on the issues that people, the swing voters in key states, feel Trump has let them down on, things like healthcare costs, wage increases, education costs. If Trump is dominating the conversation, we're talking about what he's doing every day and immigration and what he wants to talk about.
But to your earlier point, Trump is clearly a showman, right? Anyone who's watched any of his rallies can see that. And he delivers something to people or to his supporters that perhaps they want. And it's interesting when you take that element of his campaigning, his showmanship style, and you look at the field, the Democratic field, and who's the one that jumps out as somebody who would have that showmanship style?
I don't think anybody compares to Trump, and I would just add something to what you said there. It's not just what his supporters want. It's what the media wants because they carry the controversies that surround Trump. It's what a lot of people who dislike him want to watch at the end of the day because they're captivated by it. It's what a lot of independent voters want, and they're captivated by it. I think the answer for who on the Democratic field can do that or rival that is still very much an open one. Beto O'Rourke got a lot of buzz early on, but that seems to have quieted down over time. The South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg has promised to sort of provide a very different face for politics, which could be captivating. Elizabeth Warren's shown in her campaign appearances that she can really drive a message and get that sort of movement vibe going. But I don't know if we know if that's scalable. And I think it's probably likely that it won't be scalable to the extent of what Trump is doing because none of those candidates are willing to do what he does, which is sort of do things that are outrageous, self-harming in some ways to get attention.
Right.
Say things that aren't true, for instance. That's not really the style of any of those candidates.
It's an interesting X factor that we'll have to see who emerges with it on the Democratic side. All right, another defining aspect of this cycle is the way candidates are fundraising. Numerous Democrats have pledged not to take money from the wealthy. However, Biden said on Tuesday he does not want to, quote, demonize the rich. So, Michael, provide us with some context. What is the risk versus reward to Biden for embracing affluent donors?
Well, Biden is still, in the majority of Democrats running for president. The format he's using is a combination of small dollars and high dollar fundraisers. Most candidates, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Beto O'Rourke, they're doing the same thing. The difference is that Biden has been, at least so far, really successful at getting entry to some of the wealthiest rooms in the country, and his fundraising has been sort of more spectacular in some ways. At big houses in Los Angeles. Last night it was on Wall Street with Robert Rubin and a number of other financiers. I think the real danger and the downside for this, especially as the election goes on, is that candidates will need to spend more and more time doing this because it becomes harder over time to do, and that frees up candidates who, like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, don't do it to spend more time on the campaign trail, more time doing media, more time doing the other parts of a campaign.
Right.
I think the other issue is that if you can survive on small dollars, largely, if not exclusively, and you can continue to keep your campaign going, there's the real potential to raise more. There's a lower cap on how much money can be raised in $2,000 chunks in this country than there is in the amount of money that can be raised in $20 or $40 chunks. So if you're a candidate who can really tap into that, you have a longer way to stretch.
Right, the road is longer. All right, now I want to turn to the shooting in South Bend, Indiana over the weekend. An African-American man was killed by a white police officer. The mayor there, and of course 2020 candidate Pete Buttigieg, had this to say on Wednesday. He was speaking at the swearing-in ceremony of 6 new South Bend officers. Let's listen.
And we're dealing with a culture that still sometimes speaks of officers as though they were soldiers on a battlefield, rather than members of the community that they patrol. And we cannot pretend this is unrelated to race. In our past and our present, we have seen innumerable moments in which racial injustice came at the hands of those trusted with being instruments of justice. And this fact burdens everyone, all of us, no matter who we are.
So, Antjuan, Buttigieg has previously acknowledged his difficulty connecting with African-American voters so far. What does he have to do differently as a candidate to make his case to that group?
Oh, I definitely think this will have tremendous impact on how well he will penetrate the African American community. And you can look at this two ways. This could end up being a crisis for him or a real opportunity. If I'm him, while I did not hear the entirety of his speech, I would just admit that the buck stops with me as the mayor of this city, and so I bear some responsibility. Also, how we chart a pathway forward and how we deal with these things will ultimately determine the type of city we will be and the type of leader he will be. And so this impacts him more so than anyone because he's polling essentially 0% in my home state, the most important state in this Democratic primary, South Carolina. And so while we have a lot of activities going into this weekend, a state where 60% of the people who cast their vote will be African American, I am quite certain this will be part of the conversation, and he will be judged on how he deals with this crisis in his own hometown.
Absolutely. All right. So lastly, Caitlin, I want to get to you because I know you sat down with the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina today. You asked Stephen Benjamin about how the candidates are shaping up in that early voting state. Let's take a listen to some of what he told you.
The vice president's strength here is it's real. It has deep and abiding relationships in South Carolina. But I will tell you that there are a host of other candidates who have made significant inroads here, who are grinding it out on the ground, putting together real organizations, honing the message, listening to South Carolinians. Back when I first started in politics, it used to be the 3 M's. You had to have a good message, money, and manpower. Now it's message, money, and woman power.
So, Caitlin, what else did the mayor say about how candidates can break through to voters in South Carolina?
You know, I asked him about how much retail politics matter in an age that it seems to be more and more like a nationalized primary. These early polls that we're seeing in the early states reflect what we're seeing kind of on a national scale. And voters that I've talked to here and in other early states kind of note that with so many candidates, it's really hard to learn everything about them. And they're really kind of leaning on national coverage of these candidates. But he said that it's still early and that retail politics or that contact that Antjuan has talked about before really matters here, and that voters are needing to kind of meet these candidates one-on-one, see what they're about, talk to them personally. He said the economy is still top of mind for people here, even though he's seen growth here in Columbia, and also things like education, healthcare, and jobs. So candidates who can really speak to voters here, he said, will do well. It was interesting that he did note that Biden's support here in South Carolina is pretty strong, that it's real, but that there is room for some of these other candidates to break through. And that's why they're all coming here this weekend to have that chance, because South Carolina is going to be the gateway to those Super Tuesday states, those bigger, more diverse states that are so critical, especially in the Democratic primary.
All right, Michael Scherer, Antjuan Seawright, and Caitlin Huey-Burns, thanks to all of you for that. Susan Page, please stay with us.